He co-hosts a workshop at the SOAS and the scholars in Buddhist studies. His topic today is about the mindfulness, which is very popular among the world. Mindfulness is the best human abilities to be present, aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us. Mindfulness meditation gives us a time in our life when we can suspend judgment and unrush our nature curiosity about the workings of the mind. Our experience with the moon and the kindness to artists and others. In this section, we will hear about what Professor Yuri Prado has for today's audience later. Final is John River. John River is the current consulting for my foundation, Xiajinshan Art and Culture Foundation. We're working together many times, which can be expanded to Beijing, Nanjing, Taipei, then London. He was formerly head of education at the British Museum, and he has taught in many famous schools such as UCL. Also, he is the co-chair of the region's collection heritage group, consulting all over the world, particularly in Asia and the Arabic world. As a result, he cultivated his long-standing interest and experience in Asia culture and Asia museum. Today, the topic is traveling in time and space, visiting across both Asia and the museum. How should museums present Chinese religions and Buddhist art from across Asia? What does this mean for the 21st century visitor from Asia as well from the outsider? Now, we'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Katie, to share with us. I would like to hand it over to Dr. Katie here. Thank you, Dr. Here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhao. I'm going to share my screen now, if that's okay. How can I get that to be? Okay. Just to say that, you know, my specialism is not in Buddhism, but I work on contemporary art mainly. And I'm interested in looking at the idea of the spiritual in contemporary art through certain forms of art that has been developed since the 1980s and 90s, mainly from China, but also in the broader Chinese-speaking world. So I'm looking at the idea of spiritualism within this field, which often appears either through conceptual art or abstraction, forms of abstraction that kind of evoke ideas within Chan Buddhism, and also sort of crossing over with post-structural thought in the West, that artists were very interested in delving into in their work. So I'm looking also ideas that relate to their interest in certain concepts, such as emptiness and the void, and the relationship of sentient beings, which pertain to the idea of a self and the relationship of the human with the world. And I'm going to go straight through into looking at one or two works to explore this idea. And this is very much work in progress. So the idea of the spiritual in landscape painting, which has obviously been involved for hundreds of years in Chinese painting, comes into modern art through paintings such as Liu Guosong, whose work is shown here, in which you see this kind of abstracted space of a spiritual landscape that evokes the cosmos, and also brings into view ideas about spatial awareness, and also time, which I think has been present in the landscape ink painting tradition, as I say, dating back centuries, back particularly to the Song dynasty, and which is the sort of one of the heights of the landscape painting tradition. But in the modern period, I think this reappears in different ways, in which artists are extending this language of ink into something more abstract and spiritual, arguably. So we have, for example, Liu Shouquan's Zen Lotus in the early 1970s, a key figure in the Hong Kong development of art, that shows this extraordinary expression through this very radical kind of change in ink painting once it crosses the border from China into Hong Kong, and becomes really, really extended in language and reaches into a sort of global circulation of ideas. And of course, Zen is also an already translated form of Buddhism that has circulated globally in the 20th century, and particularly through the work of Suzuki in Japan. So there's these kind of notions of the sort of traveling of forms of Buddhism, and how they come in and out of painting and appear in different regions of Asia in particular forms for particular reasons. So one of the obviously key developments in Chinese art in the 1980s was the development of a new type of conceptual language in ink painting, and Gu Wenda's foregrounding of the spiritual in this conceptual artwork called Pseudo Characters, Contemplation of the World series in 1984, was one of the early attempts to deconstruct language and pose the question of Chinese culture in contemporary art, which is also pursued by artists like Xu Bing with Book from the Sky. You can see that this is not an obvious depiction of the spiritual, and yet even through this kind of unreadable character that he has deliberately made unreadable through the elements that are put together on this ink painting, he is also evoking an idea of contemplation. And this is something that sort of tallies with the time in China when artists were very much deeply trying to reconnect with texts that took them back into their own culture after decades of Maoism. And so the artists at the forefront of the conceptual movement were also thinking about how to bring this into view whilst thinking about the question of language, the question of ink, and the positioning of contemporary China with the cultural world, and attempting to sort of forge a contemporary language in ink that is also deeply philosophical. So a lot of our artists were actually looking back into the quest for meaning at a time which was very, it was a time when people were starting to try and explore new languages in art, and also reconnect with the global, having been cut off from that. So this is a sort of example of where, we might be seeing this as something which is about a sort of spirituality lying under the surface, but also being brought into view by a sort of conceptual idea rather than an actual figure, and also playing with quite complex ideas across Western contemporary thought and Chinese traditional thought. And Yang Jiechang, an artist who's now based in Paris, also took this idea as somebody versed in ink painting and traditional calligraphy, who comes from Guangzhou. He took it much further by layering ink into thousands of layers into a pure blank space, again, arguably about contemplation, meditation, and the idea of the void, in which the pure black ink becomes kind of crystallized into a different form, becomes transformed. And these are kind of ideas which Yang thought about in relation to enlightenment, and the sort of purity of the ink gains another sort of aspect in this abstract form, taken from the tenets of Chinese traditional thought, going into a purely conceptual abstract language. So we've got that, but we've also got more recent examples, such as this painter Jidzi, who's an ink painter who I will be curating at the Brunei Gallery later this year, whose work also deals with the spiritual, with contemporary evocations of landscape, space, the cosmos, and who's interested in this idea, again, rich, tallying with sort of Liu Guosong and other painters, many painters who've dealt with the ideas through visual representations, which are abstract, experimental, and they also think about traditional thought and arguably have ideas about time and space in them, which also crosses over with certain types of Buddhist thought about the world and the presence in the world, and life, beyond the material world. So we've got these sort of positionings that are just interesting to look at, with the idea of the evocation of Buddhism in China. This is actually taking you out of that into the idea of cultural heritage from the Tang dynasty, obviously, in the contemporary China, which I witnessed when revisiting China about 10 years ago, and going to Xi'an and thinking about how China is engaging its history through the public space. And I found this particularly interesting, the idea of the public space and kind of imagery, which has been placed in a highly contemporary sort of almost touristic context. So interventions across these ideas of the spiritual, evoking both historical time and conceptual language, and religious thought, rather. So we've got this pure abstraction, which I've mentioned, and Ding Yi's work, another contemporary artist who's based in Shanghai, has produced a series of paintings that are also purely abstract, and arguably some of the methodology in these painters' works is highly disciplined in its kind of meditational aspect, in which the painter will be working across very, very meticulously across the canvas on a daily basis, gradually adding to this plane, which becomes a form of representation of the meditational, you could say. And he has concertedly, his practice reaches across from the 80s to the present in this singular practice of pure abstraction, which is based on the form of a cross, crossing both cultures in philosophical thought, in mathematics across Western and Chinese elements, which are deeply embedded in a kind of unit that he expands into this pure abstract language, leading us into another plane, another sphere of kind of visuality. And we have this kind of abstraction shown in other works in which artists are delving into this idea and work across canvas in a sort of meditational form. So we've got here a very young painter who also showed this work at the Central Academy graduation. When he graduated, he decided to use pure abstraction, and it's called Nobody Pass Away. So it has this idea of the body in it, and the body and the soul are evoked through this this extraordinary painting, where he daubs the paint in single strokes across in this very, very detailed but very meditational practice. So we've also got elements of the poetic coming back with the spiritual in abstract painting, and this is Huang Yuanqing from Shanghai. Uses traditional media, traditional pure color and minerals in his work, but also you can see here the link with his own practice of calligraphy and how he's breaking down language from this rather beautiful, playful, almost musical contemporary calligraphy taken from a Tang Dynasty poem about sorrow and nature, but also across on the left this very expressive yellow abstract painting, which you can see the connection across language and non-language here.
1 minute.
Okay. So very briefly, I'll just show you a couple of other examples. There's also artists like Yang Zhichang, who I mentioned, with the pure black, at an earlier stage, experimenting with form, with language, and placing these together. He still uses calligraphy in his work. And this is the sort of thing which was being expressed in the 80s before he developed his later practice in having moved to the West. Sorry, I'm just going to move on. So within the diaspora, there are sort of forms of art where there's a kind of absence. This is a Buddha placed in an English chapel in Britain, which is made up of takeaway food cartons evoking the Chinese takeaway restaurant, in which the artist casts takeaway containers to build a figure of the Buddha as a sort of ephemeral work within Britain, and an intervention within a Christian church. So it's a very interesting work because it's ephemeral. It will be dismantled, but it is a presence of Chinese culture within Britain by an artist who's of Chinese heritage. Okay, I'll move on. And then finally, we have this incredible evocation in porcelain by Jenkwa, who's a porcelain artist based in Shanghai, who works with the idea of sort of liquidity and fixity in his work. And this work is an installation showing these drips, but they are actually made of pure porcelain, evoking the idea of traces from a leaking roof, which obviously have philosophical connotations of a time and space and perception built into them. I will stop there. Realize that I've gone over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie, for your wonderful talk about Buddhist art in a very conventional way. It's so exciting. Without further ado, we will go directly to her Professor Yuri Targo from SOAS London to share his thoughts about our resource for daily meditation for us. Take a floor, Dr. Professor Yuri Targo. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen now. Is that working? Yes.
Sure.
You do see my screen. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to have been invited to present at today's conference. The topic of my talk is mindfulness in the modern world. The conference invokes inheritance of religious belief from Chinese religions, and there are probably few practices available extant in Buddhism that are more central to Buddhism itself, that is to say meditation, and a few practices that are more visible in the West nowadays than meditation. So I'll be focusing on the role of mindfulness in the modern world, on the role of meditation in the modern world. Modern mindfulness has moved into the forefront of public discourse for more than 20 years now, perhaps 30 years, and some of the main publications that shape public opinion have covered mindfulness. Here we have a cover page from Time magazine and a passage from the Financial Times. There are many other examples that we could cite where mindfulness as a practice of therapy, a practice of meditation has featured over the last few years. What does modern mindfulness mean? How does it connect to its original practice? Mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. End of quotation. This is one of the key definitions of modern mindfulness. It was coined by the founder of modern mindfulness, if you like, John Kapitzen in 1994. There's a great deal of controversy about this definition, in part because it departs from ancient Buddhist understandings of mindfulness. Present moment awareness is cited. Is the present moment really the key feature of mindfulness, or is it the act of remembering? In Buddhism, the term that is used to indicate mindfulness is sati or smriti, and this literally means memory. In modern mindfulness, we speak about paying attention to the present tense, and that is a problem. The other problem is the modern definition of mindfulness speaks of non-judgment. And Buddhism is very judgmental. Buddhism favors virtue over non-virtue. Buddhism has a very clear ethical framework. And yet in mindfulness, modern mindfulness, we come across the notion of non-judgment, so that the practitioner does not judge what occurs in front of him in emotional terms. So again, we have a key element in the definition of modern mindfulness that seems to depart quite significantly from Buddhist conceptions. And we shall return to those questions in a minute. Modern mindfulness was introduced in 1979 by John Kapitzen. It was introduced in the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts in the USA. It really evolved around group programs to treat patients struggling with life's difficulties, with physical or mental illness, chronic pain, depression, and so forth. It was largely reliant on government grants and found application in the clinical domain. And this had implications for its ethical and for its presentational format, because on account of its connection to clinical work, to grants that were secured through the medical sciences, Buddhist connotations were very quickly and almost entirely stripped from modern mindfulness. And this is again a very important development. We have, in other words, here a development where the Buddhist practice, Buddhist meditation, Buddhist mindfulness was de-Buddhicized, was removed out of its Buddhist context in order to be eligible for government funding. The early areas of modern practice focused on body awareness in order to physiological effects of stress, of pain, of illness. The practitioners were encouraged to develop equanimity in the face of change, in the face of loss. And again, a non-judgmental distance was used to introduce that equanimity. It was overall developed to develop a sense of serenity, clarity. In other words, mindfulness in the modern practice became a form of therapy, a therapy that made life in the world easier to manage. Now, we have here a very clear departure from Buddhist conception, because in Buddhism, of course, mindfulness or meditation is used to depart from the world, to escape samsara, to enter into nirvana. So we have almost a reversal of purpose here. Modern mindfulness practice tells us how to live better in samsara, perhaps to be better enmeshed in samsara. Well, the Buddha, of course, advocated the departure of samsara. The roots of modern mindfulness are based in the Theravada tradition, in the Vipassana movement of Southeast Asia that emerged in particular in Burma in the 18th and 19th century. It was brought to the West by American students of those teachers, including Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, and others, who founded the Insight Meditation Society in 1976. So modern mindfulness was really brought to the West from Southeast Asia through the hippie movement, if you like, in the 1960s and 70s. These were spiritual practitioners who picked up meditation, mindfulness practice in India and Southeast Asia, and then imported them to the US. What is mindfulness for? And that brings us in many ways to the key question. In Buddhism, mindfulness serves to bring about enlightenment, to reduce suffering, without a doubt. That is its only and key purpose. Nowadays, in modern world, mindfulness has been repurposed to become a therapy. In healthcare, mindfulness is used to manage chronic pain, to prevent depression, and to achieve a general sense of well-being. In education, mindfulness is deployed to achieve academic attainment. Mindfulness practices in military context are designed to achieve effective and safe execution of military tasks. And only 2 months ago, I was able to attend a day-long seminar organized by the British Armed Forces that explored the use of mindfulness in a military context. Mindfulness is also deployed in prisons, in the penal system, in the justice system. Here, it is used to strengthen acceptance of the penalty and the reduction in aggression. In commerce, in banking, we encounter mindfulness too, quite explicitly aimed to increase productivity, to increase resilience in long working days, and to maximize the profit for the organizations that organize those mindfulness training groups. So mindfulness is given different purposes in different contexts, in practically all aspects of modern life, public discourse in Western societies. Mindfulness in the workplace serves to promote health and well-being. It is aimed to reduce burnout and sickness absence. It increases the mental capital. It induces flexibility, creativity, and focus. What it does not do in any of those practices is to achieve enlightenment, to bring about the soteriological goals that Buddhism spelled out, that the Buddha set forth. The key founder of modern mindfulness, perhaps worldwide, is probably Thich Nhat Hanh. He is a Vietnamese lineage holder of the Tien tradition that has many roots, profound roots with Japanese Zen. He is a native of Vietnam, border area, where Mahayana meets with Theravada's Southeast Asian tradition. And that is very significant because he brought together religious streams from the Theravada tradition with those of the Mahayana tradition, including and especially perhaps Zen Buddhism. He was without doubt one of the most important figures in Western Buddhism for the number of students he taught and the influence those students yielded. His book, Miracle of Mindfulness, has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And in the West, and it was probably one of the best published publications or pieces of research, of practice at the time. So most of modern mindfulness in one form or the other goes back to the concepts, to the practices that Thich Nhat Hanh introduced in the 1970s and 80s. And those were the very ideas that later on Western scholars picked up and used. And one of the most important people to pick up on Thich Nhat Hanh's ideas was Jon Kabat-Zinn. He was a biologist by training. He had studied meditation in South Korea. He became a Zen teacher himself, and within the Japanese Zen tradition, of course, and he founded the Insight Meditation Society, as I mentioned a minute ago. And during his practices, he had a vision in 1979, which led to the foundation of modern mindfulness. So Jon Kabat-Zinn was the single most important key figure in the modern conceptions of mindfulness, and he remained so arguably until the present day. His vision of modern mindfulness stemmed from a very eclectic, a very wide-ranging array of sources. We have elements of Tibetan Buddhism, we have elements of Zen Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, we have elements of the Theravada school. So a very eclectic, a very synchronistic history. And those interpretations come out in his own publications. What is very interesting is that Kabat-Zinn was ambivalent about the Buddhist context. He was ambivalent about the Buddhist context because on the one hand, he could not publicize Buddhism in his practice because that would lead to disconnection with society at the time. Buddhism in the 1980s and 90s was not a very firmly established religious practice in Western society. And as a result, he felt that he needed to reduce the presence of Buddhism in his teachings. On the other hand, he was, of course, a Buddhist practitioner. He practiced meditation. He worked with teachers of the Japanese and Burmese traditions.
3 minutes.
So he needed to find a way to manage, to navigate a Buddhist practice in an essentially non-Buddhist context. I have no time now to go through the individual practices, and those are all well established in the world, and they are probably not significant to my own paper today. Let me, shortly after Kabat-Zinn started his work, mindfulness was extended. It was brought into another domain, and that is into mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. This was founded by clinical psychotherapists in the UK and Canada. And in that particular context, mindfulness was used to deal with recurrent depression. It deployed a very similar format as MBSR, but it focused on negative thinking, on rumination that can lead to depression. So mindfulness-based cognitive therapy had a very specific mental focus on the treatment of depression, while mindfulness-based therapy of the type that Kabat-Zinn developed had a much broader remit, covering depression, but also covering physical discomfort and pain and other aspects affecting human well-being. The areas that cognitive mindfulness introduced or focused on was depression, emotional regulations, chronic pain, several other health conditions connected to chronic pain. It worked on the strengthening of the immune system, and it was particularly effective in connection to addiction. That is very, very interesting. We're talking about physical addiction, mental addictions, and so forth.
1 minute.
In other words, mindfulness really began to address many of the key ailments of modern society, as we see it listed here in that on that slide. It really moved to the very forefront of issues, problems, concerns that shape public discourse, that are believed to affect our role as humans in the world. And the importance of mindfulness is very nicely demonstrated here in this final graph. We see here a graph that sketches publications on mindfulness between 1994 and 2015. And you can see the exponential growth. And if we were to look at the data since 2015, we would observe an even further growth. So mindfulness, without a doubt, has moved to the forefront of public discourse. It has played, or is playing, continues to play a very important role in how we manage society. It has departed very significantly in doing so. It is no longer a Buddhist practice, it is a therapy. It has been repurposed. And the question that I want to put to the table today is perhaps, how legitimate is that? How is it appropriate to extrapolate a practice in Buddhism and put it to such different use in the West? Thank you very much.
Remarkable speech and lovely sharing. I think I'm sure that it will be important to many listener today. And then let's move on. So we'll come to the last speaker in this section, John Reed. He will deliver the talk on Buddhism across both Asia and the museum. Please, Professor John Reed.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me try and, here we go. Right. Okay, well, hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. What I'm going to do is to explore how museum and library collections in London illuminate the spread of Buddhism across Asia. You're all familiar with the general shape of that, and also illustrate the journeys of Buddhist monks west from China to India across the disputed and often inhospitable terrain between. The BM British Museum has been collecting Buddhist art from its foundation in 1753. For example, a German doctor in Japan supplied the founder of the museum, also a doctor, with contemporary Chinese art, the modern art of the time, and also Japanese Buddhist art. But unfortunately, it was being used to illustrate the superiority of a British brand of Protestantism over all other religions. As a byproduct of that, there is now an extraordinary range of Buddhist art and documentation in London, obviously partly the result of the British Empire, but also partly the result of individual collectors and international exhibitions. This extraordinary Amitabha from the Sui dynasty from the 500s on the north stairs of the museum was actually a gift from the then Chinese government in 1936 after an extraordinary exhibition in London of Chinese art, after which academics at places like SOAS, where Professor Palgo works, and elsewhere began to study Chinese art, and particularly Buddhist art, in depth. South Asia and China are both displayed in one very long gallery in the British Museum, shown here before its recent complete reinvention.
各位老师、同学，大家下午好，我是蔡立生，是华侨大学国际关系学院的一名研究生。我们很荣幸的能够参加。
Starting at the Indian end, we have one of the very earliest depictions of the Buddha, a reliquary on the left here from Bimran in Afghanistan, discovered by an archaeologist in the 1830s. And it shows one strand of Buddhist art that then traveled across Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan. And that is kind of Greek inspired. You can see the body is swaying in contrapposto style. It's a very Greek kind of garment that the Buddha is wearing. And on either side are two of the earlier Vedic gods, Brahma and Indra, and two bodhisattvas. And it's quite clear from this, which is now dated to the 1st century CE, that images of the Buddha must have been being created in India for a long time before that. Often, however, it was shown in this aniconic way, like the feet on the right from Amaravati. And one of the tropes in all the Chinese monks' travels to India is going to see the impression of the Buddha's feet, going to see the stone where he washed his clothes, and so on. The other main tradition of Buddha imagery that then feeds into Chinese Buddhism is a much more abstracted one that developed around Mathura in particular, where, as you can see, there are no distractions. There are no eyebrows, really. There's no interest in muscles. They're not interested at all in what happens when you drape clothes over a body. And these two traditions kind of meld and travel across the Silk Road, along with travelers, merchants, people from other religions. A recent exhibition in Denver on the Silk Road, for example, was subtitled Art, Trade, and Devotion. As we all know, the mythology is that Buddhism was introduced into metropolitan China by two monks on white horses in the 1st century CE. And by 148, it appears to have been established in Luoyang, but it was marginal. And the earliest surviving datable Buddha image in China is still thought to be one from 338 in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. In her work, Jessica Rawson, the book The Lotus and the Dragon on Chinese ornament, shows also how various other ideas feed into Chinese Buddhist temple design and other design, particularly the idea of the lotus coming out of India and then being characterized in a particular a Chinese way. And one sees a sort of staging post in places like Palmyra and Dura Europos, where silk was coming from the East and Western artist ideas were coming from the West, and they both meet. In the middle of this gallery, this is in its new revised form, funded by the late Sir Joseph Ho Tung, a great collector of Chinese art. As if setting out to come west, is this Tang Tomb group, which is particularly interesting because not only does it have camels and horses, it also has two Buddhist Lokapalas. And this reminds us of the amount of fusion and morphing that goes on in this journey of Buddhism from India to China. For example, we now know that Buddhism was established as far west as Merv. And in the other direction, Zoroastrians from Iran were found in a colony in Dunhuang for several centuries. And of course, we're all very familiar with the fusion of Hindu and Buddhist texts. Fa Shan, one of the earliest Chinese missionaries to go west, visited a combined Hindu-Buddhist temple in Khotan, and there were Buddhist versions of the Ramayana found at Dunhuang and now in the British Library. Another of these missionaries, Song Yun, who was born at Dunhuang a century later than Fa Shan, was by 1519 deploring the worship of false gods in Buddhist regions. One of the most extraordinary texts in the British Library collections from Dunhuang is the story of Balaam and Josaphat, based on the Buddha's life and known from texts in Hebrew, Persian, Arabic, and Georgian. And of course, Buddhism, once it reached metropolitan China, began to compete as well as combine with folk beliefs like the Queen Mother of the West and with many aspects of Confucianism and Taoism. It is, of course, impossible to overstate the importance of Dunhuang for the study of earlier Chinese Buddhism before the purges and invasions. The earliest of these several hundred painted caves are from 366. It was then later abandoned and rediscovered from 1900. Typical of this kind of cosmopolitanism is a letter in Persian transcribed in Hebrew, found by Stein and now in the British Library, one of 40,000 manuscripts discovered in the caves of Dunhuang. Today, of course, Dunhuang is a major tourist attraction. It's become a different kind of contact zone between East and West, partly as the focus of a massive international research project and as a flagship for the Belt and Road project. Here are some of the notable finds from Dunhuang in London. The most celebrated, of course, is what is still the oldest dated complete printed book in the world, the Diamond Sutra from 868. Of course, earlier texts do survive, especially from Korea, but so far no earlier dated books. And needless to say, the invention of printing helped transform Buddhist communication and the dissemination of images across Asia. And I particularly like the modest way in which the supplicant is shown at the bottom left with his slippers neatly to one side as he addresses the Buddha. This is one of the textiles that miraculously survived on the right. It's an embroidery. It's pretty big. It's like those hangings you see on the Patala in Lhasa. It's 8th century Tang. The Buddha is preaching the Lotus Sutra, and you may just be able to see that flowers are being bombarded from above. The donors, again, are shown very tiny at the bottom, unlike in Western religious art. It's about 250 centimeters high and is monumental in the same way as the Amitabha that I've shown you already from the Sui dynasty on the stairs. This is a particularly delightful depiction of Avalokiteshvara, inviting a rather glum-looking, expensive Tang lady to consider joining Buddhism and holding out the prospect, top left, of a particularly idyllic kind of paradise. I've paired this with a remarkably similar painting in mood by Jia Shan that captures this same sense of ethereal enchantment and promise. There are some other more surprising bits of evidence of the development of Buddhism in China. I'm sorry it's not a better slide, but in the middle of this, the rim of this pot, you can probably see there is an image, and it's an image of the Buddha. And this is one of the earliest depictions of the Buddha in ceramics in China, 3rd century Yue ware. And it's very extraordinary. It's from a region of coastal Southeast China, from the state of Wu that followed the Han. And this may reflect Buddhism arriving not by camel, but by sea. It's what's known as a soul jar, where the physical remains of the dead are absent. And perhaps, as Craig Clunas suggests, it's as a result of families migrating hurriedly to the south to avoid invading peoples from Inner Asia, and presumably bringing traces of Buddhist beliefs with them. So there's still quite a lot of work to be done on this. This is in a collection developed by Percival David, which actually belongs to the University of London, but which is now on show in a sort of semi-permanent loan in an amazing gallery. In
3 minutes.
Here are some just a few other images, which you'll be very familiar with. One of a set of 16 lohans in front of a wonderful painting of 3 bodhisattvas from the Pure Coolness Temple, examples of very expressive wooden sculpture, of showing people very much at ease. And one of the images I just wanted to say a bit about was the idea of how male aspects of the Buddha become increasingly feminized as they go east. It's as if people couldn't quite believe that a man could express all the aspects of pity and understanding that were being put on the Buddha and Avalokiteshvara. So Avalokiteshvara, of course, becomes Guan Yin, and in Sri Lanka on the left becomes Tara, and there on the right you have a particularly feminized kind of rather glossy Ming Buddha. And all these things you can follow in the gallery, and also the results of people like Zhuangzan on the right here, and his travels collecting manuscripts in the British Library. Just picking up on what Ulrich was talking about, today, what are we to make of Buddhist collections in museums? What is the meaning that the many Chinese tourists who come to London and my Chinese students, what meanings are they making? In some museums in America, whole Tibetan prayer rooms have been recreated, and people go there to meditate and for mindfulness and to de-stress. And it's not exactly the place to de-stress in the BM Gallery in normal times, which is now one of its most popular. Finally, I just wanted to end with a comment about our relation to other people's cultures or our own cultures in the past. The African art historian and curator Susan Fogel, rather bleakly talking about African art, says that most people can't really understand particularly religious art. The cultural context of much of the world's art, particularly that which is religious in inspiration, is remote from the contemporary museum-going public. If nothing else, the aura of faith and reverence with which it was regarded by its intended audience is missing for most of us. We can be insiders only in our own culture and in our own time. Well, I don't agree with that, and I don't imagine you do, and certainly in his life's work, Zhao Jingshang didn't either. And I hope this very brief talk may have shown some of the ways in which it's possible to begin to get inside religious art beliefs, and particularly the interaction of religious cultures in the past today. Thank you for listening.
Time up.
Super awesome, indeed. Thank you to John Reed. I think your presentation got a lot of contribution to the today conference, especially you focus on the Avalokiteshvara compare between Tibet culture and Master Sha's Avalokiteshvara painting. I think the close trade relationships, and the Chinese interested in that. I think that right now, let's move to our last part of this section for the comment or QA or critiques. Does anyone have any question for these three talks and the speaks? Welcome everyone. Director Mini, have any question or comment?
Could I pick up on a couple of points that Ulrich made? I'm very interested in what you were saying about mindfulness, because not only has this become a big issue in education, as you said, but it's also become a big issue in museums. And many American and British museums and galleries now include mindfulness sessions, meditation, yoga, and so on in their galleries, often totally unconnected, as you say, to anything Buddhist, except in somewhere like the Rubin Museum in New York, where they actually relate their mindfulness sessions to their Tibetan prayer room. And I think just to make a point about how much people need it, during lockdown, the Rubin Museum's regular users, particularly lunchtime, people coming in just to be calm, including staff, said, what are we going to do without this? So they put it online, put it on a continuous loop with the sound gently in the background of monks chanting. And this apparently was accessed, tens of thousands of times by people. So I think what we have here is really an opportunity for those museums that are doing something like that to draw people more into the real world of Buddhist art and Buddhist ideas. And I think this is beginning to happen in certainly in America, but not so much yet in Britain.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Your question. I think Professor Yuri Pago, please reaction. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's also changing in the US and in the UK and in Europe. Kapitzen's view and his view still shapes the field. Is beginning to be more transparent. He now is much more happy to talk about Buddhism as part of mindfulness. And I don't think this is so much a result that he has changed his views, but Buddhism is so much more present in contemporary society. It is so much more accepted in mainstream society, mainstream media. It all changed really in the early 2000s, I think, with Richard Gere and others who brought Buddhism to the forefront. So yes, I think it is happening across Western society and probably even across each of or many of our societies. I noted some very interesting parallels between what I try to communicate and what Katie said. Katie spoke about reconnection, about rediscovery. She spoke about modern issues and above all the public domain. Katie, I thought your last couple of slides were really interesting, where you have sort of this reconnection brought into the public domain. And in many ways, meditation turned up at several junctures in your own work. So we have really a presence of Buddhist inheritance quite clearly in modern productions of artwork, just as much as we have it in other spheres of society.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's interesting how it connects to practice as well, in the sense of things like artists taking up calligraphy practice on a daily basis, which has that inbuilt sense of kind of rigor, discipline, but also relates to the mind. So we've got these things kind of coming back to the mind and the need to train the mind. So it's sort of the act of sort of discipline of use of the brush, which leads to much more conceptual practice, but often those artists who produce abstract ink paintings have a calligraphic practice as well, and so that's quite interesting, because it still goes back to those practices that are inherent but have been quite strongly disrupted in the 20th century. So yeah, I do think the interest in the mind is actually very key to what artists were trying to sort of pursue in the 80s. And that's led to this very sort of philosophical quest, because it was a sort of seen as something that they needed to catch up on. There was a sort of a thirst for going back into thought after having thought imposed on them, shall we say, to put it very broadly.
So in your sense, we have an element of repurposing of Buddhist ideas, Buddhist meditation in this context. I mean, I saw some of the very contemporary art, and that, of course, it's very difficult to connect closely or immediately to historical Buddhist art. There are sort of shades of reconnection, but they, I think, of course, have been very purposefully kept in the background. No?
Yeah, but I think that's changing now with younger artists. So there's some younger artists who are producing more overtly Buddhist imagery in in virtual artworks, actually, interestingly, that this is the idea of sort of the dematerialization of the body in new digital artworks, which are produced by much younger artists. So actually, I think it's coming more back into view, you know, as Buddhism. But I think, you know, in between that point and this, yeah, you're right. It is definitely lying under the surface, but also there's an unwillingness to use language which you know, fails to become a global sort of visual conversation, if you like. So it's, you know, the circulation of that abstraction, I think, is interesting when it lies outside the border as well, you know, via sort of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and cultures around China, because of course abstraction itself was not really accepted for decades, from the sort of 1930s through to the 1970s. So actually the sort of refusal to be figurative, you know, is very interesting there.
It's very interesting how as everybody may know, the Jia Shan Foundation has a series of awards for young artists, and watching young artists all over the world really trying to use digital and animation to try and capture some of these ideas, which is very exciting.
Yeah, it's really wonderful, isn't it? And it's amazing, the response, and so broad and so sort of diverse, but also really dynamic and quite unexpected, I think, from a Western perspective. So I agree, I think that's a really exciting development, which Dr. Zhao's been activating, and really the response is very, very impressive.
Thank you, everyone. Every opinions and some academic component, I think I totally agree. And you know, like the circle, you know, I hope that, you know, the next time everyone can, you know, focus on another Chinese religious topic, continue to talk, to discussion. I admit that this section has been a very, you know, a very success. This is the end of the section. Thank you, everyone, your participation. I will also host the afternoon section at the same time tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you. Bye bye. And bye bye, Katie. And bye bye, Jean-Marie. Your Ricardo. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the host, Dr. Zhao, commentator and the presenter, Dr. Kathy Hill, Dr. Ulrich Pagel, and Dr. John Reed.
第5场论坛题目为港澳台闽华人宗教与区域信仰文化特色，邀请主持人陈建煌老师。
好，各位与会的观众大家好，下午好啊！现在我们是进行第5场的发表。我们这一场的主题是港澳台闽华人宗教与区域信仰文化的特色。这一场的发表人有3位。首先，第一位是罗良平教授，他是南华大学宗教学研究所助理教授。他要发表的论文是一贯道发一组道物发展的探究。第2位发表人是蔡立珍，他是华侨大学的研究生，他要发表的论文是在地祭祀圈与跨国信仰圈，德化蜈蚣真仙信仰在马来西亚的传播。第3位是郑开心，他也是华侨大学的研究生，所要发表的论文是庙宇发展中的他者与信仰模式的转变， 以厦门城城隍庙为例，我们今天邀请到的讲评人是黄国清教授，他是